Alright guys, I've got a different approach to chess that you might like to try out. Just came to me this morning and I had one game. I'll take you through the game. But the idea is that I think that many of us pay far too little attention to what our opponent is doing, what our opponent's plans are. And I've got it in my checklist. Why did my opponent make that move? What are my opponent's ideas? What strategy are they trying to roll out? But more than anything, just think about putting the screws on your opponent. Look at the game from their point of view, literally, and think what do they want to do, and how can you just contain them and frustrate them? Okay, so this is the game I played this morning. My opponent's rated in 1300s. And we have e4, e5 in the Vienna game. Fair enough. Bishop comes out and it's the wayward queen attack, right? So my opponent thought for 40 seconds over that move, over his next move, and plays the knight out here, right? So I now grab a pawn with check, and I'm also, so the king's in check, I'm also attacking this bishop. So there's only really two moves here. Either you can move the bishop back to e7 or the queen to e7. And that defends everything. So the queen now moves in and we exchange queens. And now, what is the situation? Well, I'm a pawn up. I've got the central pawn majority. My opponent has two pieces out in the board, whereas I only have one. This pawn is being attacked and it's being defended once. So now, knight to f3. There's no immediate threat, so I'm preparing to castle. And getting my pieces out, controlling the board is good. d4 would also have been a perfectly good move, I think, at that point. Black castles, and now I come in with an attack. Now I am undefending this pawn, but if my opponent grabs the pawn, I grab c7, and the rook, because the knight hasn't moved, the pawn hasn't moved, the rook is trapped, and I would win the exchange from there. So my opponent needs to respond to that. And this is one move, but it's a move you don't really want to have to make in chess, but I've forced my opponent to make it. Right, so he's put his knight on the rim, which is dim, and now this knight is occupied with defending that pawn. So now, I still want to castle my king, I still want to develop, but I'm quite happy keeping this knight tied down for the time being, and this pawn is under attack. So what should I do? e5, okay? So e5, attacking the knight and pushing forward in the center. And I figured that would be more forcing. Okay, so now the knight comes into e4 and I just push d3, kicking the knight again. So I'm carefully checking every square where the knight can go. Can't go here or here because of my pawn. Can't go here because I have two attackers on there. I have knight and bishop, right? Can't go here because it gets taken, and so there's only really one square where the knight can go. Knight goes to c5. See, so I've forced my opponent now to move his knight away from my king to the only safe square. And now c3. So c3, what I'm doing here is I'm stopping this knight from coming here. Knight can't go there because his own piece is on there. Right, so I'm just containing my opponent, and then at some point d4 might come, and I'll build a nice dark squared pawn chain. Notice that his remaining bishop still can't get out into the board because the b and the d pawns haven't moved. So black now kicks my knight just comes back to d4. We have d6, and now I bring my bishop out. So this pawn is under attack. It is defended once by my knight, but I figure why not develop a piece and protect the pawn a second time? Because if I'm going to have a dark squared pawn chain there, my bishop will need to get out at some point. So now the knight comes back with a double attack, so it's forking my knight and my bishop. Now I've got a few options here. I mean, one idea was pawn takes d6, and if the knight takes my bishop, I take his bishop and threaten the rook. But if you figure this out, there my pawn has gone off the e-file, right? Knight comes off the e-file. Then if I take the bishop, attacking the rook's going to come to e8, pinning the pawn, and my king still isn't castled. So I figure that actually the better option here is simply to retreat the bishop. Keep it on a decent diagonal where it's got some good control. And if black wants to capture on e5, I can recapture with the knight or with the bishop. Now, he does indeed capture, and here I decide to capture the knight, forcing black to double his pawns, but bishop takes, okay? Now his light squared bishop is out in the board, and I capture the pawn now with my bishop. I figure that I can still play d4. This knight will still be constrained. The knight can't move here because of my bishop, right? If I'd captured with the knight, then the knight does have this option at least. Okay, so I capture there. Bishop comes across looking at the d3 pawn, so I just push d4, which was kind of my plan all along. So I'm still a pawn up. I've got one central pawn. My opponent has no central pawns. D and E pawns have gone. Now he comes to attack my knight, and again, choices. So what does my opponent want to do? Well, he wants to capture my knight, force me to recapture with the g-pawn, and maybe that wouldn't even be so bad, because it would open up the g-file. I can put my rook on the g-file and line it up with my opponent's king. However, I figured, well, I'm not castled yet. I still don't know if I want to castle queenside, because there is the threat of, he's still got two bishops on the board, so that could cause me some problems. So I just move my bishop out to e2. Now if he wants to capture, I'll recapture with the bishop. I can still castle fine. Then I'm the one with a bishop pair. So he now pushes c5. So this is a pawn break. He's trying to change the pawn structure, partly because his knight is so bad, right? This pawn is undefended. We have to notice that bishop is undefended. So now I simply castle, because I'm not worried about this move. Quite happy with that. That would attack this pawn and the rook. If I recapture with my bishop, now he takes. And now again I've got three options. I can recapture with the pawn, I can recapture with the knight, or with the bishop. So in this instance I decide to recapture with the bishop. Leaves my bishop on this good diagonal, looking down towards g7. And potentially also, still constrains this knight to some degree. Knight now comes out, and I play rook to e1. Because I've evaluated this, I don't think that there's too much of a threat. Knight can't come here. If it comes here, I could capture with the bishop. And that indeed is what my opponent plays. Now my opponent, because he's being frustrated, I guess, this is actually a blunder. Can you see the blunder? Well, it's a kind of an intermediate tactic, because this bishop here on e7 is undefended, right? Now, currently, there's a bishop in the way. Well, there's two bishops in the way. But if I capture the knight, bishop captures, I get the bishop. Okay, and that's what happened in the game. So now I'm a pawn and a knight in front. We have rook to there, and I decide, rather than trading rooks, because I have to be careful about the back rank, my king can't come to f1. Okay, so first and foremost, what does my opponent want? Well, my opponent wants to see if he can back rank me somehow. So I grab the free pawn anyway. I've now got two attackers on this pawn. And the rook now comes in to e2. Now I notice that my rook is actually defending b2, so I don't have to worry about that pawn right now. And I don't have to worry about this pawn because my king can recapture. So what I do now is rook e1, because my knight is actually defending that square. So that's absolutely fine. So I'm putting the question to this rook. Now, anywhere this rook goes on the e-file, I could still capture the rook and trade rooks if I wish. And I am up 5 points. So black captures, I recapture. And now black's second blunder. Rook here, okay? And he misses, knight takes d3, and there's no back rank because the knight is still guarding e1. So another mistake there. Now I simply slide my king across to f1, guarding this square and releasing this knight from its duties of guarding that square. We have pawn a5, trying to save the pawn. Now the knight comes in, defended by the bishop here. And I've got a significant material advantage at this point. Also notice that I've used far less time than my opponent. This is, I think, a 30-minute game. I've used 10 minutes, he's only got 6 minutes left. Pawn comes forward. Now I reroute my knight round to g4. And I am even thinking that there's a tactic here. Bishop takes pawn, right? If pawn recaptures, knight takes with a fork on the king and the rook. Rook comes across looking at the bishop. Now I move my knight around because it doesn't really have much forward future here. It can't go there, there, or there from g4. So reroute the knight, see what my opponent wants to do. He just pushes the pawn. Now I bring my knight into f5. And the final blunder. Knight to e7, forks the king and the rook, and my opponent there resigns. So, something to think about in these games is, when you play something like this, right, and it's your opponent's turn, think about flipping the board. If you're playing in the browser, you can hit the X key on your keyboard, which just changes the orientation of the board. If you're playing on the app as well, there's an option in the settings to flip the board. So looking from your opponent's point of view, okay, so if I'm black now, what do I want to do? Well, think about castling, okay. This comes in, and now, you know, it just makes a lot of sense. Okay, this is being attacked. There's not too many ways to defend it. I've got bishop here if I'm black, or I've got knight here. So black plays knight there. Okay, and now you're thinking, well, what does my opponent want? Well, at some point he'll probably want to kick my knight. He'll want to get his knight out. So I'm thinking from his point of view, you know, I want to keep that knight constrained, but this is a tactic. Wins tempo, and now this pawn to c3, and you can see that kind of thing from the other side of the board, right? He's just had to move his knight back to here. He probably wants to kick my knight, get my knight away, and release this guy. So let's constrain this guy. Let's stop him going there, right? So that's the thing. I'd really encourage you to do this in a few games. Really think from your opponent's point of view, not just your own, because there are 2 games going on at once. Don't just think about your chess game. Think about your opponent's game and how you can constrain it and frustrate it and just sit it out and let your opponent make those mistakes. So you've got to be bloody minded. You've got to be clinical. You've got to make sure all the bases are covered. And this really turned out to be a relatively trivial game from White's point of view in the end. So that's it. That's it, really. Think about the fact that there are 2 games going on at once, right? There's yours and there's your opponent's. And if you prevent your opponent from playing, then I do think it's 50% of the game, right? 50% of it is pushing forward with your plans. 50% of it is absorbing your opponent's plans, frustrating your opponent's plans, locking him down. Make life as difficult as you can for your opponent and let them make the errors. And particularly if you're one of these people who, as a beginner or improving player, that you get to the point of thinking, well, you know, what do I do in the middle game? Well, that's something to do. In any instance, think, how can I improve my situation and make life worse for my opponent? Okay, so kicks knight, knight centralizes. Now my opponent's knights are in a bad place. My knights are in a better position, not too far away from his king, right? Pushes a pawn, and just thinking about what does my opponent want to do? Well, he wants to capture here. Well, let's let him capture, right? and let's improve my final minor piece. Well, it's not quite my final one, but you know, very straightforward chess. Nothing spectacular. No fireworks here. Again, I'm not going to react to what my opponent's doing. If he wants to take there, that's fine. I'll just recapture. Or I could recapture with a knight. You know, I've got lots of options. Castle my king, get to safety. Okay, takes. And here I'm only 1 pawn up, but my opponent is driven now to errors. And there we go. Blunder. Right? And it doesn't take too long. Bang. And the game is over. Okay? So there you go. When you're playing chess, play 2 games. You get double the value, you get double the fun. Right? Play your opponent's game as well as your game. Okay? And I think that you will see an improvement in your results. You'll see an improvement in your rating. All right, guys. Thanks for watching. See you later.